Okay, so this is the next part, which for the human circulatory system is part 1. We talked about 3 things that we need for a closed circulatory system, and the first one we're going to talk about is transport vessels. So in us, they are the blood vessels. We have 3 types of blood vessels. We have arteries, veins, and capillaries. And so the first little thing that we were looking at was trying to kind of look at them, look at their features, and be able to tell which is which. Okay, so one thing that you could think about or look at if it was a diagram is color. And color, we tend to show arteries in red and veins in blue. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the other thing that you need to look at, because you're not always going to see color, is the thickness of the layers. So both arteries and veins are 3 layers thick. And so we have an outer epithelial layer. So this is an outer epithelial layer. This is an inner endothelium. And then there's a muscular layer in between. So this muscular layer is really thick in an artery. It has to be really thick because arteries are under a high amount of pressure. They're receiving blood from the heart. So they're under a high amount of pressure, and they also help to kind of move the blood along. So they're pulsating in order to help move the blood along. So this first one is an artery. And so this one is the vein. It's also 3 layers thick. But the muscular layer is much thinner in a vein, and a vein has a wider diameter. So that's a wider opening than an artery. Capillary is a little easier to pick out. Capillaries are really, really thin. They're only one cell thick. Okay, so they're 1 cell thick because capillaries are the vessels that are found between arteries and veins. They're the connecting vessels, and they're really thin so that they can allow for exchange of materials. So oxygen and nutrients will leave and go out to the tissues. Wastes and carbon dioxide will come in and be picked up from the tissues. Okay, so the questions. Which one has the least layers? The capillary. How many layers thick is it? 1 layer. Which one has the thickest layer of muscle? So that's the middle layer. The artery has the thickest layer of muscle. And which one has the largest diameter? That's the opening. So that'll be a vein. Okay. This is a good diagram to kind of compare the 3. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is their wall, which we just described. Okay, so in an artery, they have a thick muscular wall and a small diameter. A vein has a thin muscular wall and a bigger diameter, which is easier to see in this diagram. Okay, and the capillary is only 1 cell thick, which has a large surface area for diffusion of materials. Its job. Okay, what direction do they carry materials? Okay, think A for artery, A for away. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart, whereas veins carry it back to the heart. So they carry it towards the heart. Capillaries join arteries and veins together. Now, there's stars on this one. Most arteries carry oxygen-rich or oxygenated blood. There's 1 set that do not. Okay, so arteries that are taking blood from the heart to the lungs don't have as much oxygen. So the pulmonary arteries are deoxygenated because the blood that's going out to the lungs is going to pick up oxygen. Okay? Likewise, the only veins that are oxygenated or have a lot of oxygen are the ones that are carrying blood from the lungs back to the heart. So the pulmonary veins are the only ones that are oxygenated. All the rest have more carbon dioxide. They're O2 poor or deoxygenated blood. Capillaries, on the other hand, are where those 2 gases are exchanged. I'm going to get rid of this box because it keeps making everything small. There. Ooh, make it big again. There we go. The next comparison is whether or not they have a pulse. So when you go to check your pulse, this on your side of your neck where you're checking your carotid, or if you're checking your wrist, you are touching an artery because it's the arteries that are carrying the blood that's moving from the heart. So that's why you'd feel it in your artery, but not in a vein. Okay? By the time your blood reaches the veins, there's no real pressure being felt from the heart. Veins, no pulse. Capillaries, no pulse. Okay? Arteries, veins are the ones that have important valves that allow blood to flow back to the heart. And we're going to talk about, in this video, we'll also talk about how the blood is returned to the heart through veins, because it's really unique. So the valves are really important in that. There are a certain amount of certain types of valves in arteries, but we aren't going to be talking about them so much. Okay, so we say no valves here in the idea that the arteries don't really rely on the valves in order for blood to flow in the direction it has to go. Capillaries have no valves. Okay, question. Which picture shows arterial system and which shows the venous system? And why do we use red and blue? So basically, the red is the arterial system and the blue is the venous system. And the reason for this is hemoglobin is a molecule that's found in red blood cells. When it has oxygen on it, when it's important for carrying oxygen. And our red blood cells, their job is to carry oxygen, and they're able to do it because of the hemoglobin that's in them. So if hemoglobin has oxygen bound to it, then the blood appears a brighter red. If it doesn't have as much oxygen, so if it's deoxygenated, then it's a darker color. It's not really blue, but it's not the nice bright red when there's lots of oxygen there. Okay. This one is an important one for you to understand. So the idea of how our blood flows, this is just a general path showing the order of the vessels. So we have a larger artery, and then the blood will pass into smaller vessels called arterioles, which are like smaller arteries. Okay? Then they get down to these purple vessels, which are the capillaries. And then blood will pass through the capillaries and then be picked up by venules. So venules are like baby veins. Okay, arterioles are like baby arteries. Venules are like small veins. So the venules will come together to form a larger vein. So what happens at the capillary level? And you should have this on a handout. Basically, when blood leaves from your heart, it's under a tremendous amount of pressure because you can imagine the heart is pushing the blood out through a vessel. So when it reaches the capillary level, on the artery side, so the side that's like where the blood is coming into the capillary area, this is under a high amount of pressure because it's still receiving the push from the heart. So as they go into smaller and smaller vessels, that pressure gets even higher. So there's a super high pressure right here on the arteriole side of the capillary bed. Okay? And the capillaries, remember, they're one cell thick. So materials that are able will pass out into the surrounding tissues. And then some stuff will be picked up. But by the time it reaches the other end of the capillary bed, the pressure is a lot lower. So there's a lot lower pressure in these venules than there was in the arterioles. So we're going to look at it a little closer. But in order to make sense of the next diagram, you need to understand certain terms that we'll refer to. So fluid pressure, or FP, is pressure exerted by blood on the capillary walls. Sometimes in certain animations or videos you might hear called hydrostatic pressure, okay, or even blood pressure. So if you think of it as blood pressure, that's pretty easy to think of. It's the pressure exerted by blood pushing outwards against the capillary walls. Osmotic pressure, remember we talked about osmosis? Osmosis is the movement of water. So osmotic pressure is pressure exerted by water on the capillary walls. It's usually trying to push inward, okay, trying to push inward into the capillaries. It's largely dependent on the presence of certain proteins in the blood. So I don't know if I have I don't know where my highlighter went, but so it's largely dependent on the presence of certain proteins that kind of draw water in. The proteins are too large to pass out into the tissue area, okay, so they stay within the blood vessels in the capillaries and they draw water in. So, which way do substances move? Substances will move out of the capillaries if the fluid pressure is higher than the osmotic pressure. So that makes sense, because if the pressure pushing outward is greater than the pressure pushing inward, then stuff's going to be pushed out. Stuff is going to be moved in or absorbed when the opposite's true. When the pressure pushing inward, so the osmotic pressure, is greater than the fluid pressure. So this diagram you also should have, and it's just showing what we just kind of said. So at the arterial end of the capillary, this is showing a capillary, okay, so, and these are tissues, the cells within tissue that's lying surrounding this capillary, okay. In between there's some fluid, but this is the capillary, this is the arterial end, and this is the venule end. So at the arterial end, it's receiving blood from the heart, so it's under a high amount of pressure. So the FP, or the fluid pressure pushing outward, is higher. So these numbers are in millimeters of mercury. I'm not going to expect you to remember the numbers. I just want you to look and see that this pressure pushing outward is higher than the osmotic pressure, or OP, pushing inward. Okay, so because the pressure pushing out is higher, then materials are going to move out. So there's filtration is what we call it. So oxygen and nutrients that are being carried to the tissues are forced out because of this pressure. Okay, so along the bottom it's kind of a summary here. It says fluid pressure is greater than osmotic pressure at this end, so substances are forced out. So what substances are going to be forced out? The stuff that our cells need, which makes sense, oxygen and nutrients. Okay, since stuff has been forced out at this end, then as you move along the capillary, then that fluid pressure, since stuff was pushed out, the fluid pressure is going to decrease. So you can see the number went from 35 to 15. That pressure has gone down, but the osmotic pressure is still the same. So since at this end, since it is higher than the fluid pressure, or higher than the pressure pushing outward, okay, since this pressure pushing inward is higher, then materials are going to be pushed into the capillary. So at that end, that's where the water is going to be moving back into the capillaries, but with it is going to be picked up some wastes and some carbon dioxide. So they'll go into the venule end of the capillary so that those wastes can be carried to organs of excretion. Okay, so this last point summarizes it. So the fluid pressure is smaller than the osmotic pressure at the venule end, so water and other substances will move into that end of the capillary and be carried out through the veins. So it says what substances move out at the arterial end, so that would be the stuff that your tissues need, oxygen and nutrients. What substances are absorbed at the venule end, that would be the wastes and stuff that you want to get rid of. So that would be like carbon dioxide and other wastes that your cell has produced. So this diagram is really important. It's one that's pretty simple to draw, and I'll probably go over that with you in class, but it's fairly simple to draw and label. Again, I don't care about the numbers. The arrows and size of arrows that you use are simple enough to explain that part, but you should know what substances move in and out and what end of the capillaries they move in and out and why. Alright, this is another one that's really important. So when your heart is pushing blood out to the tissues, so the blood traveling through arteries is feeling that pressure from the heart. The heart pumps and pushes the blood out through the arteries. So to get it to the tissues, there's a force there that's pushing it. But as we just saw, when it gets out to the capillary bed, then that pressure goes down because a lot of the stuff is forced out into the tissues. So the question is, how are our veins able to carry blood back towards our heart? Because there's no pump that's kind of pushing through the veins. So instead, our body uses ways that we can work against gravity, because the only stuff that's going to pass back to our heart using the force of gravity would be stuff that's above our heart, right? So things in our head region, and when our body parts are raised above our heart, then gravity can help. But otherwise, we have to rely on something else. So what happens is we have these special valves in our veins, and our muscles are important in order to get our blood flow going, to get it back to our heart. And hopefully through this you'll understand why it's so important, why they say it's so important that you get some exercise every day, that you go for a walk, that you're moving around a little bit, not just sitting all the time. Okay, so there's a certain section in your book that describes this, but we're gonna have a look at this diagram, and it's something that you should be able to draw as well, and we'll go through it for a practice together. But basically, what happens is these black lines are showing a skeletal muscle. So maybe it's a muscle in your leg, okay? And so the skeletal muscle is surrounding a vein. So the blue is a vein, and this is some blood that's kind of trapped. And these are the parts of a valve. Okay, so we have valves in our vein, and right now the valves are closed, so the blood is sitting kind of pooled on top of the valve. So what happens is when your muscle contracts, it pushes in against the vein, and it forces the blood to pass up through the valve. So it forces the valve open, and it forces the blood to pass up through towards your heart. And then when it relaxes again, so when your muscle goes back to like this first diagram, I really should have drawn another one, which would have made more sense. Okay? When it relaxes again, then the valves will close, and the blood is going to be trapped up higher towards your heart. Okay? So if you were more complete with your diagram, then I would have a third one here showing, okay, this blood has moved up higher and it's trapped higher, because that's what makes more sense. Okay? Just make sure anytime if you're asked to do a diagram like this, that you have it really well labeled. Okay? So if you were to look just at this diagram, you should be able to tell what the parts are just by looking at it, and then you can do a little quick descriptor like what's down below. Okay? So basically, your body movements are what helps you get your blood back to your heart. It's really, really important. Even if you're sitting still in class and you're writing a test and you want to try and make sure that you're getting lots of circulation and getting lots of blood flow going to your brain, and so you can think very clearly, you can sit there and wiggle your toes in your shoes, because that's still helping to circulate your blood. Okay? The poor people who have to stand at attention the whole time during Remembrance Day service, sometimes they end up passing out because maybe they weren't told, you got to do things like wiggle your toes in your boots or something like that so you can keep your blood flowing. Otherwise, eventually you might get to a point where you're going to pass out because there's no blood reaching your getting back up to your brain if it's not being circulated. Oh, so here's some kind of cool questions that you can think about. Why does your arm go weak if you hold it above your head for a long time? Okay, so normally your arm is hanging down below where your heart is, so it would have to have the valves and have movement of your muscles in your arm to help to get the blood back to your heart. But if you hold your hand up above, then those valves are going the opposite direction and gravity's helping the blood to flow really quickly back. Okay, it's important if you're injured and stuff to be able to do that, so you get the blood back to your heart and your brain and everything, so that it's not all coming out your cut, for instance. But if you're standing there for a long time, eventually your hand's going to feel a little fuzzy because the blood is now run back down towards your heart. Okay, same sort of thing if you're feeling faint for standing for a long period of time. Why is it beneficial for you to move your legs or wiggle your toes while you're writing a test? Well, we just said that. Why don't we need veins or valves in the veins in our brains? Yep, you're right. Okay, your brain is above your heart. Okay, so it uses the force of gravity in order for blood flow to occur. Awesome. What causes you to blush, to go pale, to bruise? Okay, so when you blush, the blood is rushing to your skin area. When you go pale, the blood is being kept away from your skin area. And when you bruise, something has impacted your capillaries and squished the blood out more than it should be, or your vessels, and pushed the blood out, so it's all colored in that area. Okay, so that's it for that particular section.